What a privilege and honor to spend a little bit of time with you this morning. Absolutely delighted to do so. And I want to thank all of you that have tuned in from afar to engage in this larger conversation about the future of food and food safety and food technology. I, for one, I am pleased to welcome you because this conversation is important. I've been asked to talk to you about the US FDA's new era of smarter food safety and another topic really emphasizing a portion of that new era, which is food traceability. And that's where we're going to spend most of our time today. But I just wanted to acknowledge that GS1 has been a critical partner for me, both in my many years in the private sector and now in the public sector. And they've done groundbreaking work, as we know, paving the way for what I believe is a new future in which foods will be tracked and monitored from farm to plate, no matter where they're produced in the world. FDA's partnership in particular with GS1 and with each and every one of you is probably more important today than it's ever been, as the food system, as we all know, is becoming increasingly global, and consumers from all countries are increasingly want to know more about their food, regardless of whether it was domestic or imported. In fact, in the US alone, about 15% of all foods that the American consumer eats comes from afar. 94% of the seafood that we eat here in the US is imported. 55% of fresh fruits and 32% of vegetables. And so we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the global food system and the need to harmonize approaches. If you can go to the next slide, please. But before I do that, I have to recognize something that's obvious. We're all living in the midst of a global pandemic, a crisis of historic proportion, no question about it. I think when the history books are written, we'll look back and we'll say, the global food system was tested and experienced its largest test in over 100 years. And granted, I know that all of us have lessons learned because of the COVID pandemic and the impact it's had on food. But by and large, certainly in our country, and I know in yours, consumers can still go to their favorite grocery store and find tens of thousands of different food SKUs available for a fraction of their hard-earned dollars. So we're passing the test. We're not scoring 100%. We certainly aren't scoring an A+. And the lessons that we learned, I believe, are going to allow us to create an even smarter and more resilient food system. So thank you for all that you've done to produce safe and available food for consumers all over the world. You're making a difference. On behalf of FDA, we mean that very sincerely. And we think of you, folks that are working in food, as being on the front line of this pandemic as well. So let's start off with this premise. You've already heard Mark describe how the world around us is rapidly changing. There's no question about that. In fact, some are predicting that we're going to see more changes in the food system in the next 10 years than we've seen in the past 20 or 30. If you look at the level of investments that have been made on food, granted, the pandemic has really caught everyone a bit by surprise, but these levels of investments, I believe, will continue. If you think about what's happening in the food system, and some of these changes are being accelerated because of the COVID response, but think about reformulations of food for healthier food products. We see new food products being generated, cell-cultured foods, plant-based foods, and more. We see new food production methods being realized, and we see the food system increasingly digitized. And so the world around us is changing very rapidly. If you can go to the next slide, please. And I think with those changes, we have to realize to succeed in these modern times, this never-ending change in food, we need more modern approaches. To succeed in these modern times, we're going to need more modern approaches. And so at the FDA here in the United States, we've launched an initiative this year, believe it or not, during the height of the pandemic, something that we're calling a new era of smarter food safety. The reality is that we've been working on this new blueprint or approach for well over a year. We're about to unveil it when the pandemic hit, and rightfully so. We had to put our plans on pause, but men and women at the agency continue to work on this, and we were able to unveil it in July of this year. Now, what's a new era of smarter food safety? Let me assure those that are listening that this is not a tagline or a slogan. It truly is a new way of thinking, a new way of working, and our goal is to produce or create a more sustainable, transparent, and digital food system that's safer for consumers and that's better for the planet. I like to emphasize that at the US FDA, we've been working on modernization since our inception. In 2011, many of you know, our country passed the most sweeping reform to our nation's food law called the Food Safety Modernization Act that was referred to in my introduction. But we have this commitment that modernization isn't something you do once a decade. It's something that's a belief or a value system, and you're committed to continued modernization each and every day. I do want to emphasize that this idea of smarter food safety is based on a couple of things that are important. Number one, it has to be people-based. We know that to create smarter and better approaches, it's going to require engaged and motivated and smart men and women like those on this call. It starts with people. Secondly, it will, for us in the US, continue to be FSMA-based, rules and regulations that guide the way we work. But a lot has changed since FSMA was passed in 2011. So for us, smarter food safety will increasingly become, and I think for many of you in nations around the world, technology enabled. Now, let me emphasize, when I talk about technology today during our discussion, you might hear me refer to blockchain or distributed ledger technology. You'll hear me refer to artificial intelligence. I want to be clear that for us, it's never about the technology. It's always about what is the public health problem or challenge or business issue that we're trying to solve. And we just happen to believe that technology is providing the new wonderful tools that are enabling us to solve problems in new, more creative and efficient ways. Next slide, please. So this new era of smarter food safety really has this overarching goal. I want us all to remember the big picture. The big picture is that we have to bend the curve of foodborne illness. We have to provide safe and sustainable food for consumers worldwide. Now, what I'm showing here is foodborne disease stats published by the US CDC that gives percent change in incidence of foodborne disease per 100,000 population over the past few years. And I could show you this data many different ways, but the bottom line is this: if you look at the incidence or the burden of foodborne disease in our country, as well as developed countries around the world, you'll see similar statistics that suggest that we're not really making progress. There's no question at the first part of the 20th century, and for most of that century, foodborne disease plummeted with advancements in medicine and sanitation and chlorination and HACCP. But in more recent times, foodborne progress against some of the new and emerging pathogens have stalled, if you will, and stayed flat. Now, some of you will rightfully say, Frank, well, that's largely because our detection abilities have gotten so good with tools such as whole genome sequencing and pulsed field gel electrophoresis. And that's true. But my admonition or encouragement to you today is we can't use that argument as a crutch for the next decade. Just like public health officials and departments and agencies around the world have gotten better at detecting foodborne disease, and that's a great thing. We should continue to be advocates for investments in public health. Just like they've used new and emerging techniques and technologies to advance their ability to detect foodborne illness, we need to do the same to strengthen the safeguards in the food system, the safety net. We do need to do the same to accelerate foodborne prevention. And so for us, it's ultimately about bending the curve of foodborne illness. Now, we were using this terminology before the pandemic hit, and now globally, people know a lot about flattening the curve. So this idea of bending the curve, I think, is common. You can go to the next slide, please. The new era of smarter food safety is founded on 4 core elements. I like to call them cornerstones to the foundation of this new era. 1 is tech-enabled traceability. 2 is smarter tools and approaches for prevention. 3 is new business models and traditional retail food safety. And 4 is food safety culture. Because of a short amount of time, I'm going to touch on all of them a little bit, but we're going to spend most of our time on tech-enabled traceability. So next slide, please. Let me begin, and I don't think I have to spend a lot of time persuading you. You heard some great comments at the introduction that this idea of food traceability is an idea whose time has come. We need better food traceability. And I don't have to spend a lot of time persuading you. Here's an example of the strong public health, what I call the strong public health and business case for better food traceability. In November of 2018, some of you will recall that in our country, there were illnesses of E. coli 157H7 associated with US consumers. The CDC told us there's a statistical link. People that are ill with this E. coli have consumed romaine lettuce. We couldn't determine what brand or where that romaine came from, and rightfully so, US CDC as well as the US FDA issued a public health advisory advising consumers not to eat romaine lettuce. This advisory, by the way, came right before one of the biggest holidays in our country, Thanksgiving, which is largely centered around food. And the damage that that did to consumer trust was really very significant. Trust me, I get it. Food safety is mainly about public health, but it's also about consumer trust. It was troubling for me because if some of you will recall, in 2006, there was a similar scenario. Granted, we were talking 2018, 2006, 12 years earlier, more than a decade earlier, there was an outbreak in the United States, E. coli. At that time, health officials said spinach. All producers in the US grocery stores and food service pulled spinach. And it took the US FDA 2 weeks to trace that spinach back to source. When they traced it back to source, it was determined that that outbreak was caused by one producer, 1 day's production, one lot number. Again, the damage that that did to an entire industry, hard to measure. The spinach producers in this country told me that it took almost 6 years for them to recover. But I could go on and on trying to persuade you that there's a strong public health and business case for better traceability. In our country, the examples that I'll use is in 2009, there was an outbreak with the Peanut Corporation of America, a company that produced about 2 to 3% of the peanut paste in this country. That peanut paste ended up being used in many, many different products. And it resulted in recalls, over 1,000 different SKUs recalled in our country. Some of those recalls literally came in 2 months after the initial outbreak. Again, a lack of traceability. And I could go on and on. The bottom line is it's time for a new era of better tracking of foods from farm to table. If you can go to the next slide, please. Now, I'm going to share what success or what the future looks like, and then we're going to come back and talk about the new proposed food safety rule here in the United States. Before I joined the agency 2 years ago, I spent 30 years in the private sector, the past 10 years before joining FDA for a retailer, a very large retailer, the world's largest retailer that I will call today Retailer W. But one of the pilot exercises that I did in the private sector before I joined the agency was to test new and emerging technologies and could they play a role for enhanced food traceability. And so I'll real briefly tell you the life of a mango so that you can see what we're really after. Mango seedlings are planted and they generally take about 5 to 8 years for those mango seedlings to mature and become large trees that bear fruit. In the United States, mangoes when consumed are generally mangoes that have been grown in Central or South America. Again, after those seedlings are planted, about 5 to 8 years later, those trees are bearing fruit and they're ripening. Farmers will send farm crews out to pick those mangoes. If you follow along this diagram in the yellow line, those mangoes then go to a packing facility where they're washed, hot water treated, and packaged. Those mangoes in this instance get shipped from Central and South America by air, land, or sea to the United States. One of the photos there is trying to depict that in the scenario that I'm describing, those mangoes, once in the US, were further washed, peeled, sliced, and packaged in clear clamshells and refrigerated, sent to about 40 plus food distribution centers across a pretty large country, such as Australia, in this case, the United States. And then those packaged mangoes made their way to about 6,000 retail outlets. They were placed in refrigeration on display, hoping that consumers would walk by and see this beautiful package of sliced mangoes, purchase them and take them home to consume them. Now, I wanted to see how good is the US food system at tracing foods back to source. So I literally purchased a package of those sliced mangoes that you see in the center bottom. I brought it into one of my staff meetings. I placed it on the conference room table and I told my team at that time, the traceback study starts right now. And how long do you think it took them to trace those sliced mangoes back to source? It took them 6 days, 18 hours, and 26 minutes, almost 7 days. Now, some people laugh and say that was a long time. The reality, that's actually pretty fast. Why is that? If you think about the food system, it's pretty complicated these days, and these types of journeys are not unusual. But the way traceability is kept today, It's still largely done on paper, one step up, one step back traceability. The data attributes that are captured aren't standardized. In this instance, my team found out that these mangoes were produced in Brazil and they didn't speak Portuguese. And so there were a lot of challenges. So we did a pilot study using distributed ledger technology, trying to standardize the data elements that would be captured at each point in the food system. And we wanted to see how that worked. Literally 30 days after the pilot, scanned a package of sliced mangoes, and we were able to trace sliced mangoes back to source using distributed ledger blockchain technology in 2.2 seconds. Now, I call that food traceability at the speed of thought, getting back to source. The benefits were tremendous because if there's a food scare and it's going to take you 7 days to discover where those mangoes came from, and you have to pull all mangoes off the shelf, that's 7 days of lost sales. And so you can find that source quicker. If it truly is a contamination at a certain farmer, you can find out where that occurred, remove that product, and protect consumers. But there was a lot more that came from that. If you go to the next slide, please. And I just want to emphasize that when we're talking about food traceability, what we're talking about is greater transparency in the food system. And so sometimes people say, well, Frank, why are you so enamored with food traceability? I call it the Achilles heel of today's food system. Pretty impressive. Tens of thousands of SKUs available for a fraction of your hard dollar. But there is one Achilles heel. I gave you all the examples, romaine, PCA, I could go on, flour. The Achilles heel is a lack of transparency in today's food system. And so when people say, well, what's the benefit of food traceability? Clearly, if there's a food scare, you can trace a contaminated food back to source quicker, presumably prevent illnesses. That's secondary prevention, making the illnesses smaller. Clearly, there's a lot of benefits so that you don't damage the livelihoods whose farmers are unaffected in the event where you do these large public health advisories that damages everybody's livelihood and trust. I would say that it leads to primary prevention, and that being able to get to source quicker in the event of a scare allows you to do better root cause analysis and prevent those types of problems from happening in the first place. So that's a form of primary prevention. But this is what I think is the game changer. I call better food traceability and transparency a game changer for the food system because it provides this very powerful motivating factor: transparency. Transparency of where foods come, how they're produced, how they travel from farm to your store if you're operating a store, or to the customer's shelf. Today, we have literally the opposite of transparency in a lot of parts of the food system. We have a lot of anonymity. And is anonymity a good thing? Think about things where people's behaviors and actions and processes matter. Do you want a lot of anonymity in banking? Do you want a lot of anonymity in the classroom? No. Transparency is the equivalent of shining a light, in this case on the food system, different nodes or actors or actresses in the food system. And that transparency results in a powerful concept of people self-governing their behaviors. The traceability pilot that I described, you might think the benefit was food safety. The reality is, even for the world's largest retailer, having that kind of transparency allowed us to see where there were opportunities to make small, nimble changes in the supply chain, and small changes add up to a lot of benefit. And so this is really the big picture goal. If we work together, food traceability is foundational to a lot of benefits in the food system. Transparency will lead to efficiencies, greater sustainability, greater safety, consumer confidence, and trust. You can go to the next slide, please. So under FDA's new era of smarter food safety, our first step in this journey was to propose a food safety rule. That's right, a rule. We've issued a proposed rule in October of this year. It's out there for public comment. We're accepting comments through the end of January. We've been asked to extend the comment period, and so that's under serious consideration. But we've issued a proposed rule. And there's a couple of things about the proposed rule that I want you to know about. I've looked at food traceability legislation, Mark, in country after country, and you're probably a little bit like me. When you see it, they tend to leave us a little bit unfulfilled because they were written very much for the 20th century. They generally have language something like this: one step up, one step back. traceability. We know that most people are complying on paper. They don't really talk about the data elements or attributes that are needed to trace foods back to source rapidly. And so, I think we can do better. And so our proposed traceability rule, there's a couple of things I really want you to take away from today's conversation. Number one, it's really anchored around what we call key data elements and critical tracking events, KDEs and CTEs. And I'm going to come back and talk a little bit more about that. Another portion of the food traceability rule is that it has a list of foods that would require this additional record keeping. It's really being done under the auspices of the Food Safety Modernization Act that was passed in 2011. At that time, Congress knew that we would always need to do a better job with tracking and tracing of foods. And there was a proposal at FSMA called Section 204, additional record keeping for certain foods. And so that called for what are the records that need to be kept. We've decided to come with this approach of key data elements and critical tracking events, because that's the equivalent of harmonizing this very large and decentralized food system on speaking the same language. One of the reasons it's hard for food traceability to scale is because it's a very large and decentralized food system. But if we can harmonize around the key data elements and the critical tracking events, in that sense, we all start speaking the same language and it's easier to scale. We have proposed a food traceability list. And notice that I called it a food traceability list. For those of you in the audience that know a little bit about FSMA Section 204, you'll know that in there was language of high-risk foods. We've intentionally dropped that language for concern that it might convey that these foods are riskier or there's a problem when reality, all foods can be risky if not handled or produced the right way. And we didn't want to mislead consumers. So it's just called the food traceability list. And we believe that this will serve as the foundation for traceability to scale. Our vision and goal is to have end-to-end traceability for all foods, all SKUs eventually, but we'll start there. You can go to the next slide, please. A couple of other key concepts that I want you to know. The way the rule is written, it does touch on the whole supply chain. When you read Section 204, you'll see that the US Congress told us that we weren't to mandate whole supply chain provenance. But the way the rule was written, it is written in such a way that if every node or part of the food continuum does their part in terms of traceability attributes for where that food came from and where it's going, then it will be easy to have provenance from farm to source or from source to consumer. And with technology, we believe that would facilitate connecting those dots. It's important to note that it's not just a US rule. It will apply both to US foods and foods produced abroad that are imported into our country. I've already told you that it's going to apply to certain foods. That makes sense if you're thinking about where do you start on food traceability. Even when I was in the private sector at Retailer W, when we launched our first blockchain-enabled food traceability initiative, we started off by sending all of our leafy green suppliers a letter because that food had a very high public health significance. And so you got to start somewhere, and you'll see the foods that we're proposing that the US start on. There are going to be some exemptions, as you can imagine, small growers and small businesses and maybe retail establishments with a low number of employees, and all of that's in the proposed rule, and we're open and wanting comments. If you can go to the next slide, I'll build on it. So this is the key feature, critical tracking events and key data elements. I will tell you, when the team created this, we looked around at consensus standards that exist, such as GS1 in the United States, the Produce Traceability Initiative. And we tried to write a regulation that required critical tracking events and key data elements that were pretty consistent with the consensus standards. We don't want people to go out and have to create new records or new requirements. And our sense is, if you're already adhering to some of these best of the best consensus standards, you're well on your way to compliance with the FDA's food traceability rule. The critical tracking events are things like you're familiar with. Growing would be considered a critical tracking event. If you're a grower, what are the growing coordinates? What is the harvest date? Receiving is another critical tracking event. Transformation of foods, if you're changing foods, for example, because you're slicing it or co-mingling it, that would be a critical tracking event. Creating a new food out of ingredients and forming a new food product would be a critical tracking event, and shipping would be a critical tracking event. And the key data elements are things that you're familiar with, some that I mentioned, certainly location, product identifier, and there is, if you look here at the very bottom, something in bold, a traceability lot code. One of the things we've seen in the US, and you've probably seen it in your country, is that sometimes as food travels from farm to table, oftentimes lot numbers are assigned to foods. We've seen it quite frequently where new lot numbers are assigned to a food product, even though the food has not changed or it's not been transformed, it's just changing hands of ownership. And that makes it very difficult to track foods with a lot number that changes just based on ownership. And so in the proposed rule, we have this term called the traceability lot code, and the request or requirement in the proposal that that traceability lot code not change unless the food is actually transformed or becomes different. And so that's a significant feature of the proposal. If you can go to the next slide, please. Because of time, I won't spend a lot of discussion on this, but I want to give you a flavor for the types of foods that are on the proposed food traceability list. Again, in section 204, the US Congress gave us some factors to consider and how foods would get on the list, and they included 7 factors. One was the frequency of these types of foods appearing in outbreaks, severity of those illnesses, the likelihood the food might become contaminated, the potential for growth, were there interventions at production, consumption rates, how much does the consumer, the US consumer eat, and then the cost of illnesses. We've created a wonderful ranking model of commodity hazard pairs. It's available on our website. We suspect that this will be one of the points of most discussion, if you will, among regulated entities. But we did have a very science-based manner of how foods got on the list. This list will be a living list. It's not a list that will be cast in stone forever. Clearly, if consumption patterns change, if new interventions or new foods emerge that are of a significant public health consequence, new foods could get added to the list and foods could come off the list. While we won't be doing this type of exercise every month, we do envision every couple of years taking a fresh look at the hazard commodity force ranking process. And there's a lot of information if you're interested in how this list was developed. If you can go to the next slide, please. So that's a real quick overview. Again, we've published a lot of collateral and supporting documents on the FDA's new proposed food traceability rule that gives you a flavor for it. But I believe that this lays the foundation for food traceability to scale, and I'm pretty excited about it. I think the fact that it's a decentralized and distributed food system and that we hadn't harmonized and aligned around speaking a similar language, that was one of the barriers to scaling food traceability. At this time, we're remaining technology agnostic, and so we know there will be different technologies that emerge and help connect those dots, but we do envision that technology will be the way this is generally done by food producers. There's these 4 core elements. I literally have just a few more minutes here because I want to make sure we answer questions and get into discussion. We've got our section in the blueprint on smarter tools and approaches for prevention. On the bottom left, new business models and e-commerce. There's work to be done there. And on the bottom right, food safety culture, realizing that to make progress in food safety, it's not just food science, but it's concepts of organizational culture and human behavior. But just let me give you a flavor for one more piece of the new era, and I'll close. If you go to the next slide, what you'll see is when we talk about smarter tools and approaches to prevention, increasingly, we're going to have to leverage data and insights to gain food system efficiencies. We've all heard this idea that the amount of information data in the world is doubling every 2 years. So one of the things we wanted to see is, can we use new tools and techniques to make sense of data? The reality is we're probably collecting more food data and food safety data than ever before. The problem has always been that there's this vast divide between data and our ability to make sense of it. And as data starts becoming more digitized, we know food safety data food supply chain data on a piece of paper is a dead end. But when you digitize it, it's the beginning of meaningful action. And now we happen to so be living at a time where there are these new powerful tools such as machine learning and artificial intelligence that is bridging that divide between the amount of data and making sense of it. So to make a long story short, what we did is, I told you 94% of all seafood eaten in the United States is imported from abroad. American consumers want foods that are imported in the United States to be safe. We work with foreign governments and foreign suppliers. But another thing that we do is once foods come across our port of entry, we screen every single line of imports through a predictive tool, a computer tool. We wanted to see if we overlaid this functionality of machine learning on our current analytical system, could we increase our chances of finding volatile products? So we took 2 years of import data coming through a system that we call Predict. We overlaid that system with machine learning, and lo and behold, our proof of concept showed that by leveraging these types of new and emerging technologies, we could increase our chances of finding that violative container of seafood by almost 300%. Now that's powerful, isn't it? The idea that we will never have enough resources to do everything that we want to do. And by leveraging these new and emerging technologies such as machine learning, we might increase our predictive capabilities. And so that's another flavor so that you get a feel for what we're doing with this new era of smarter food safety. There's a lot more to talk about. I encourage you to visit the US FDA website, download a copy of our blueprint, download the new proposed food traceability rule, and let us know if you have thoughts or ideas or if you want to work together. You can go to the next slide. I'll close with this. I really appreciate the leadership that's being shown by GS1 Australia and Food Standards Australia and New Zealand. The reality is that scaling food traceability isn't something that any one entity can do alone. It's going to require collaboration. Food is a global asset, and we're going to have to do this together. And so while there's challenging times, we're living in the midst of this COVID pandemic, the one thing I am assured of is that working together, we will create and we can create a stronger and more resilient food system. Thank you very much for listening. I look forward to your questions.
I've got a couple of questions from my perspective, and if we have time, we'll try and get some questions from people online as well. I was interested in just drilling down a bit around the enhanced traceability work that you're doing. In particular, there's been a lot of dialogue about traceability. I'll just highlight a couple of areas around enhanced traceability. One of the issues that we have in Australia and New Zealand is that we have a small number of very large producers, but also a large number of very small producers, and how you get the traceability requirements across those. I'd be interested in your comments. And then I just noticed on the chat there, somebody talked about how you do the traceability across international boundaries and whether that's an area. So just be interested in any comments you've got on those areas.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Appreciate it. Yeah, no, that's a great question, because the one thing we have to do is we can't create traceability systems and hope that people are adopting new technologies and create some type of divide between small and medium enterprises and large. I actually believe that good food traceability and transparency is good for all size producers. People want to know more about their food. I also am an advocate. While the rule doesn't require digitalization, we are proponents of digitalization, and I don't believe that digitalization will create a divide. In fact, I think digitalization will allow small and medium enterprises to compete with larger food producers. And in fact, you look at developing countries such as Africa and South Africa, what you hear is that one of the best tools that the farmers ever got there was not the hoe, but it was a mobile cell phone that allowed them to connect the buyers. And so I'm convinced that digitalization allows small and medium enterprises to compete with larger enterprises that are brick and mortar. But we're going to have to be cognitive of making sure that we don't create a divide. And so as technology is increasingly used for food traceability, what we have to do is figure out how do we create what I call low to no cost business models for these traceability solutions to scale. In that any cost is proportional to the benefits you derive. I like to just say social media. Look, I'm on several social media platforms. I don't pay a cent to get in them. Why do I get in them? Because I derive business benefit and business value out of it. So I just think we have to be very creative in how we create these ecosystems, digital ecosystems, in a way that doesn't disincentivize small and medium enterprises to participating. And I'm absolutely convinced that it can be done. I also am convinced, Mark, it's a good question, that food is a global asset and it can't break down at international borders. If it does, we're in a bad place. I think it largely begins with harmonizing around these key data elements that we're talking about here today. Groups like GS1 standards know that. They've paved the way on standardization on data elements so that business enterprises, business to business relationships can happen and people can speak the same language. But it would be very tragic, Mark, if we saw, because all the predictions are food traceability regulations are going to proliferate around the world over the next 10 years. If they proliferate many different ways, it's going to be a big mess. And so it's harmonization and collaboration.
I absolutely, Frank, I totally agree with you there. I think those comments you just made at the end in terms of the reality is we have increasingly internationalized food supply chains, and we all depend upon each other, and that kind of harmonization effort really is key to this, really, to making sure that we actually go to that. That brings, I guess, leads nicely into another area, which is around system operability, interoperability. You know, clearly a lot of this depends on that system interoperability. So just again, any updates on that area? And I think particularly for food manufacturers, in case of how it looks from their side. Yeah,
no, you know, a lot of the things are, they're synergistic, and you'll see a lot of redundancy here, Mark, but that's a great question. Interoperability is key. We're already seeing the private sector innovate, and we're seeing more and more people doing food traceability and clearly supply chain logistics leveraging technology. But the systems have to interoperate, if you will. That's why I was a fan, and I'm still a fan, and I've explored and learned a lot about decentralized ledger technology. The reason I have an interest in that is if you think about today's food system, what is it? It's very decentralized. It's a very decentralized and fragmented food system. And we've tried to get this very large decentralized food system into centralized databases. That's been very hard. And so if you think about the definition of blockchain, it's a decentralized digital ledger. Its architecture fits the decentralized nature of the food system. But even with that, there's work to be done on interoperability. Now, as we've started working on these key data elements, critical tracking events, I'm a believer that we could have centralized databases interoperate if we're capturing standard structured data formats that can be easily exchanged. But I've seen firsthand, Mark, how some of these technology solution providers have created their own set of data standards for tracking foods. And you can have two centralized databases that will never speak. And for them to speak, there needs to be a lot of customization. And if you know the business to supplier relationships, it's multiple. And so we're never going to do it. So this concept of interoperability is key. It begins with harmonizing around the data standards. And then we need to make sure that the solution providers know that there won't be, it's just too big of a food system, a one traceability system that fits all and dominates and conquers the whole world. And so they have to speak to each other for traceability to scale. But I think getting people on the same plane with the same language is number one. The other thing I would say, Mark, just pulling back a little, I'm sure you've experienced this too during the pandemic. What we saw here in the US, right after the pandemic hit, we were asking consumers to stay home and shelter in place. So they were stocking up on foods, and we had initial outages and out of stock, certainly for center of the store type items. We then, as hotels and restaurants closed down, we had some supply chain disruptions. It wasn't that we didn't have enough food in the US, we had too much food in the wrong places. And I don't know about you, one of the things the US FDA found itself is reaching out to industry to try to gather intelligence. And I believe some of the things that we're talking about here today, digitizing the food system, having greater visibility and transparency on how foods flow from farm to consumer, would be invaluable in a time of crisis like we just went through at the peak of the early starts of the pandemic. This supply chain transparency would allow us to, more quickly pinpoint where were their bottlenecks and facilitate foods getting to the right places.
Absolutely, and I think that final comment that you made there in terms of what's happened with the pandemic and really the necessity to actually address some of these issues really very quickly is really paramount. Funnily enough, just leading on from that, one of the questions that I noticed that came up did highlight some of these areas, and the question was around about whether there's a balance between bottom-up and top-down approaches for governance in the food system. In other words, is there a balance between centralization and decentralization? Particularly, you've been talking about the distributed ledger technologies, so where's the balance, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, Mark, that's great. I don't know that I have the answer, but let me just give you Frank Yiannas' personal view on this. Even if you're functioning in a decentralized distributed ecosystem, you need to have some type of form of governance. Governance will dictate the rules of the roads. How do you get in? What type of behaviors or data sharing practices are appropriate? And if you have two large decentralized and distributed food ecosystems, governance will decide whether they can interoperate or not. Because if you're operating by different rules, one decentralized ecosystem might not want to participate or interoperate with another decentralized. So governance is going to be really important. But Mark, this is just me speaking, so I don't want anybody to attribute this to any official position. I believe that as a society, we have to explore a more decentralized model of creating trust. I like to say, whether it's a political scandal, whether it's a financial crisis, whether it's a romaine lettuce outbreak, they all result in the same thing, a lack of trust. And I think consumers feel, because I've read the surveys and I've talked to many of them, that they feel that institutions at times have failed them. And I think as a society, if we can create more decentralized and distributed models of credible and authoritative trust, that might be a good thing to provide checks and balances. So an ecosystem that has very trusted nodes that are validating that the data in the ecosystem is accurate and you can trust it. And it might involve some large international players that are very well known, might involve regulatory agencies, academics. But I just think we ought to spend some time to see if there's anything there in terms of these decentralized and distributed systems of trust. And so I think it's a big idea, one that we haven't fully fleshed out.